All right, everyone. Thank you for joining the latest Trees Around the Globe Student Research Campaign webinar. This is the State of Trees, November 2025. And thank you for our speaker, Adriana Northcutt, for this great title. I love it. And so many folks have come to me and said they love this title. And I said that I love to take credit for it, but it came directly from our speaker, Adriana. So the value of a tree, roots in the culture, community, and the future. And this is going to be a great webinar today where we have Adriana Northcutt is going to be our primary speaker today, our featured speaker, and then our own Peter Nelson will bring it on home towards the end of the webinar. And then we will have some Q&A after both presentations today. And then we can have some discussion. And Peter Falcon has agreed to monitor the chat and then also direct some of the Q&A during the webinar today. So a couple little quotes that I always like to pop in, to kind of get some inspiration going for the webinars. One is from Marie Curie, Polish-born French physicist, two-time Nobel Prize winner. All my life through, the new sights of nature made me rejoice like a child. Just thought that was a cool quote. And then Gaylord Nelson, an American politician, environmentalist, founder of Earth Day. The ultimate test of man's conscience may be his willingness to sacrifice something today for future generations whose words of thanks will not be heard. Thought that was interesting as well. So just some words of inspiration here to get started. All right, the agenda today, right now, some introductions, some housekeeping, and some metrics. And then I'm going to go over what you've seen in some of the emails that I sent out and what you may have seen it on our campaign pages. Right now, several days ago, we started the 2025 tree height, 1 month tree height and land cover intensive observation period. And then we will turn it over to Adriana Northcutt for her featured presentation, The Value of a Tree, Roots in Culture, Community, and the Future. And then we'll do some Q&A after her presentation. And then I will pass it over to Professor Peter Nelson and basically observing Alaska from the ground in space. And then we will have some discussion, and then we will adjourn. Okay, so I want to announce this first before we get into the main part of the presentations today and some of the metrics. Our next campaign webinar will be, and please note the change of day here. We usually do like a Tuesday or a Wednesday, but this happens to be Thursday, the 11th of December at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Time, 1800 UTC, 1900 CET. This is going to be the State of Trees, December 2025, The Rhythm of the North. And this title is awesome as well. This comes from Dr. Podest, The Rhythm of the North, Tracking the Vegetation Growing Period from Space. Love that title. Okay. And as you know, Dr. Erica Podest is a research scientist and NISAR Community Engagement and Training Coordinator at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And you may have seen her several months ago. You might have been part of our webinar where she presented on the NISAR mission. And she also presented on the NISAR mission back in November of 2024. So, she's a great proponent of our campaign and has been working with the GLOBE program for a while, and of course with NASA science for a long time and the satellite Earth observing satellites. So we want you to come back on the 11th of December to hear from Dr. Erica Podest for this great State of Trees December 2025, The Rhythm of the North, Tracking the Vegetation Growing Period from Space. So really excited to hear about this presentation. All right, a couple metrics here. Again, here's our map of where our campaign, our major participants come from. 70 countries as part of the GLOBE program in the green here. And then we have here, I apologize for the small font, but as you know, we are in year 8, but we've had a pretty good jump in specifically the tree height and land cover observations. And I'll show you here in the last 5 days. And this is for, I am attributing this to the IOP that we put this information out there. Now, it hasn't been put out on social or anything, but we've put it out, through the campaign, through the distribution list, and the European Phenology Campaign has also shared this with all of their folks. So we're really, really glad that they did that. I created a video for them, to gain some interest in that, because they're having their 2025 autumn campaign right now where they're focusing on green down. So they're urging all their participants while they're doing the green down observations to also take tree height and land cover observations as well. So we're really, really, excited for them to have them share, this 2025 1 month IOP, which began the 21st of November and will run through the 21st of December. And I'll show you some couple statistics that I have and metrics I have for that already. So, but you can see year 8, we're already over 4,300 tree height measurements just since the 1st of October of this year. And we're over 2,000 land cover observations, and the greenings over 1,700. And then basically the totals here, we are over 258,000 observations from over 78,000 global sites as of today. This is about an hour and a half ago when I was able to get to some of the metrics. So as you can see, oh, sorry, this up here, this little tree up here, we have not had 867 webinars. So that would be pretty amazing. Sorry, but that 6 should have been erased. So my fingers, I must not have seen that looking at it closely. So it should be, of course, 87 webinars plus 35 special for 122. So I apologize for the 867. So yeah, that would be bold. All right. So last couple slides before I pass it over to Adriana. As I mentioned, we sent this out a couple times. The Trees Around the Globe Student Research Campaign is hosting right now a 1-month tree height and land cover intensive observation period, or IOP. And this is for November 21st, 2025 to December 21st, 2025, where we're hoping to see some change. Okay, well, as you can see here, we're seeing a lot of change, of course, now in the Northern Hemisphere because we're having a lot of green down. As you can see, these 4 pictures across the top in the Northern Hemisphere is really showing a lot of green down. It's showing the change in autumn leaf color. And these are examples of tree leaf change color in Germany, Italy, Lithuania, and the United States. And these are ones that I got from the Globe database. And these were taken from this October and November that I grabbed. And then, of course, we're not seeing that type of change in the Southern Hemisphere, right? We're not seeing, because it's not autumn in the Southern Hemisphere, but we're seeing some amazing green and beautiful flowering colors here. And these are ones that I also got from October, November in the Globe database from Argentina, Australia, Brazil, and Madagascar. So we want the tree height and land cover observations. And I want to say that going through the photo, a lot of us with the Globe Observer team, we go through some photo approval. Okay. And when we go and we look at the pictures and we check these out and we make sure, we go through a lot of the photos to make sure they're okay to go into the Globe database. And some of the photos that I see are just absolutely amazing. But I want to tell you that I usually go through most of them on Monday, first thing Monday morning. And I was just seeing just an amazing amount of photos coming in from Brazil over the last week. So, I mean, it was just the amazing amount of photos coming in from Brazil. Literally hundreds and hundreds of photos coming in from Brazil. So just actually absolutely amazing. So with that said, we have a lot of numbers coming up. So first things first, I created this quickly this digital badge that if you take tree height and land cover observations, now there's no specific number, but if you do both, okay, if you take some of both, I'm just going to say some of both, because we don't want to get you specific. We don't want you to have to do 100 of one and 100 of another. Okay, we're going to let you have this badge, and it's not going to have this black text over that says "Earn this cool digital badge." I put it over here so nobody can just like swipe it. Anybody with any type of photoshopping skills can get rid of this text, whatever. But this background picture is one that I took locally in Maryland in the United States a couple autumns ago. I just saw this was the colors in this picture were great. It was only about 10 miles from where I live in Salisbury, Maryland in the US. And I just thought this was such an amazing picture with the amount of colors. It was taken basically next to an abandoned home. But if you take tree height and land cover observations during this 1 month period, you're entitled to this badge. Okay. So once this IOP is over, okay, I will then, we'll figure out a way to get this digital badge to you without this black text on it, of course. But what I want to draw your attention to is we just started this IOP on the 21st of November, right? It's only the 25th of November. So that was Friday, and it's only Tuesday, and it's already in the database. And you can see here on the map, this map is as of today. There are 622 tree height observations from 230 global locations, and you can see on the map they're all over the world. You can see, especially here. I mean, of course, in the U.S., you can see here on the East Coast and the West Coast. But if you look down here in South America, you can see all around the West Coast and on the East Coast, of course. And then you have some in Africa and lots in Europe as well, and in Asia too. And then in land cover, we have 189 observations from 109 global locations. So we're off to a great start. So we're super excited that, these are really coming in. And I say great start because this is a lot of observations in just like a 4-day period. So we're super excited that, that we're getting numbers that are coming in faster than we normally get. When there's not like an IOP or anything running. And also, if you want to learn more about the IOP, and I can put this in the chat after I stop sharing my presentation here, I'll put this in here, and you can go in. If you know where the campaign website is, if you just look at the left-hand navigation, there's one that'll say campaign-related IOPs. You just click on that; it'll take you to this link here. But I'll share this in the chat as well. But yeah, so this is where we stand right now. We have a lot of observations of tree height and land cover coming in already. So, we're super excited to have this IOP going. And one of the things that we want to do with this IOP is we want to be able to, see where they're all coming from, of course, the tree height and the land cover, but we want to also be able to do some comparisons. We want to be able to do some comparisons of the tree height data to the ICET2 data or potentially the JEDI mission data. If you were part of, the one that Globe was working with at Northern Arizona University, you might have seen that on Globe, and I think I shared it at one of the campaign webinars. That it was one that Mark Bretney was leading to. It was the Africa basically tree height IOP, where they were asking for the tree height observations, working with Northern Arizona University to help the scientists with the JEDI mission and their what's called their L4 product or level 4 product to help compare the data that they were getting on the ground from the globe observers, getting the globe tree height data and comparing it to the JEDI data. And as you remember, JEDI, GEDI, is a global ecosystems dynamics investigation, and it's an instrument on the International Space Station, which takes tree height observations between 51.6 degrees north latitude and 51.6 degrees south latitude. So they wanted to get some data that they can use to compare, to get that secondary level of data to compare to the JEDI data. So, and then we also have the land cover data that we can use to compare to missions, that land cover data that we're getting from like missions, with the Landsat data as well. So, we're hoping that you can really, help us get, a lot of that data. And like I said, the folks in Brazil are really stepping up. We're really getting a lot of data from Brazil. All right. So, feel free to reach out to us with any questions about the IOP. And then, if you have any questions, put them in the chat and I can answer them, if you need me to during some of the presentations. But, please pay attention to those presentations when they're coming up. So with that said, our featured presenter is Adriana Northcutt. She's a former 17-year educator in the Juneau, Alaska School District, currently STEM educator and Regional Energy Catalyst, SSP and she can explain what all this is. SSP from the Renewable Energy Alaska Project, or REAP, Anchorage, Alaska. And today she's going to talk to you about the value of a tree, roots in culture, community, and the future. And thank you so much, Adriana, for presenting today. And she's coming to you from Alaska today. So, Adriana, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to you.
Great, thank you. All right. Me. All right. Well, hello, everybody. And I realize for me, it's morning, but for most of you, it's not morning, but here in Alaska, it is. So I'm very excited to be here, really honored to get the invite to come and share my journey, starting as a classroom educator and then now in my new role within the Southeast region of Alaska is my focus. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So my presentation is going to focus on carbon and the value of a tree. And just wanted to share these images here. I'm in Southeast Alaska, and so we have a lot of old growth forest in our area. We're in a temperate rainforest. So this is an image just like from, being out in the forest, kind of our view of what it looks like with lots of flora and fauna and a wide array of different plant life. And then I am also going to connect with kind of the value of a tree culturally in our region. And so also a photo here of one of our totem poles in our region that we do have quite a few of them actually in the forest that are part of that kind of traditional storytelling value for all of the generations. So really important to recognize kind of our forests environment here can be very different from a lot of places that people have experienced. So as was mentioned, I currently am part of the Renewable Energy Alaska Project, which is housed in Anchorage. But I hold a really special position with my organization. We're a nonprofit, but we have partnered with one of our tribal affiliates in Southeast Alaska, the Sustainable Southeast Partnership. And so my role is kind of really specific to my region. And so I am the energy catalyst for my region. So I work through all the communities in Southeast Alaska. We do a lot of education outreach, K through 12, community outreach, and education tied to individual communities. And then we do a lot of energy planning. And so my organization is all throughout the state, but I'm really lucky and get to just work and focus on my region. So I live in Juneau, Alaska, but I get to work with all the surrounding communities in Southeast Alaska, which is pretty amazing to be able to live and work where you've grown up and support the communities that I've engaged with my whole life, especially as an educator, and getting to support them in this different way. Another one of our partners with my organization is Alaska Energy Smart, and I, in the presentation, have shared one of the lessons that we have partnered with them, and we have a whole array of free curriculum for educators that I'll make sure gets shared with everybody. A lot of our focus is on renewable energies, but we do a lot of work in the, like you'll get to see an example of our value of a tree lesson that we developed. But we have lots of different opportunities for folks to kind of engage with how energy impacts their community. And this is me and my family in Juneau and one of our favorite hikes. So I have an 8 and a 10-year-old, and my husband's also an educator. He taught secondary social studies and English for about 23 years. So this is where we raise our family. This is where I've grown up. So it's really great to be able to share a little bit of my home with you today. I also do want to share the work that I do specifically is really grounded in our regional core cultural values. So Southeast Alaska, for time immemorial, has been the land of the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian people of our region. And so the work that I do as an educator, as a community member, and in my role with my organization is really thinking about these core cultural values and thinking about protecting and honoring our land, the strength of body, mind, and spirit, our ancestors and future generations, and then our social and spiritual balance. And so that's something, in particular, my role with the Sustainable Southeast Partnership, that we really make sure that we focus on those values in the work that we do in communities. And then I did also want to kind of kick off with this little quote here. Environmental stewardship doesn't demand perfection. It craves our dedication to making a difference one mindful choice at a time. And because a lot of my work is done with youth, I really focus on this idea or this value of stewardship and helping everyone recognize like the choices that they make has an impact on the now, but really thinking in the cultural values, it's always thinking 8 generations ahead for the Alaska Native people. And so that's a really important aspect of the work that we do, is thinking that many generations ahead and helping our youth think in that way as well. So today I'm going to focus primarily on biomass. And that's because that's a little bit of some of the work that we do with my organization. But I kind of have a whole journey with this. And so as we go along, you'll kind of see that journey unfold in front of you, and how I started my, I guess, experience with Globe as a classroom educator, and then how I've been able to bring that into my current role with Renewable Energy Alaska Project. So I know I'm in a well-versed group of folks, but just thinking about what is biomass. So renewable organic material that comes from plants and animals. Here in Alaska, we do use quite a few of these different types of biomass as a way to heat a lot of our region, and then also for energy uses. I'm primarily going to focus on wood biomass because that's something that we are really pretty dependent on in our state for heating. And so that's kind of what I'm going to focus on today. And that's what one of the activities that my organization has developed in cooperation with Globe. One thing that we go into the communities and help communities think about. So a real quick kind of overarching look at the state of Alaska. So in our state, we have, and I don't know if anyone has ever been to Alaska, but a fun little kind of party favor, if you will. If you hold your hand up, and you can actually create the state of Alaska with your hand. So all of you have the state of Alaska that you can show people, which is pretty fun. So in the state of Alaska, you can see we're a really large state. And we, like I said, are pretty dependent on biomass as a way for heating systems primarily. So outside of that, we do have our energy is focused. We have quite a few hydro projects in Southeast Alaska. Our rail belt area, so from Seward, Alaska, up to Fairbanks, we call that the rail belt because that's where we have a train system that can help transport. They use primarily natural gas. But the rest of the state, which is pretty rural because there isn't road systems to a lot of the locations around the rest of the state, is a lot of wood biomass usage, and then primarily diesel is our heating oil is our primary use for energy. So thinking about that, currently we have 53 operating really large biomass systems in our state. And that displaces about 500,000 gallons of fuel annually. That does not include the heating systems that are in people's individual homes. And so you can imagine that's pretty high in our state due to the high cost of fuel and electricity. So we have some of the highest cost of electricity in the United States is in the state of Alaska. So this little visual here is just kind of showing you the blue dots are current operating systems. And this is from 2014. And since then, I checked in with one of my colleagues that actually builds these maps, and they realized like, oh, yep, we need to do an updated one because there's probably another 10 systems on since 2014. And these are large systems that are primarily using cordwood or pellets. Depending on the area and whether they can have the infrastructure to process the wood and season it. So depending on different parts of the state have different systems based on just that access. But then you can see that there's quite a few projects that were in the works or going through feasibility studies. But as of right now, we probably have another 8 to 10 of those large blue dots across the state. So reality for our region, specifically in our rural communities that are not on the road system. So here in Southeast Alaska, for example, we don't have a road system connecting us. So everything has to be flown in or brought in on a barge or a ferry. So as you can imagine, getting fuel to those regions is really challenging. And so the benefit of using biomass is that it can be harvested locally. And so there's a lot of really positive outcomes for using the biomass in terms of being able to provide work for locals for harvesting, using wood that's already down for varying projects or reasons, not having to actually go and cut any fresh wood. Um, and obviously, the big benefit is our carbon cycle. So it's already CO2 that was being held naturally by our trees, and then when we burn that wood, it releases back into the atmosphere. But then some of that CO2 is then processed again through our natural carbon cycle. So this is an image here of in one of our communities in Angoon last year. We did a large community event where we just shared information about different careers and things that can support the community locally around energy and around biomass, and then did a large delivery to the elders. And so this is wood that had been already cut and seasoned, and then it was delivered to the elders as they were starting to get low on their stock of wood and for their homes. And so that's a huge part of our regional expectation, is that we're going to support our elders by doing things like this, like delivering wood to make sure they have enough heating fuel to get them through the cool winters. And then over here on the right, you can see the distribution of imported fuel oil. And as I mentioned, around our state, it is very, very challenging because they have to get bulk fuel because the delivery systems here are very limited. And so, for example, in some of our Southeast communities, twice a year is the only opportunity they have to get their bulk fuel deliveries. And we're lucky in Southeast because we are pretty, our waterways aren't as challenging in terms of we're not in the out open ocean because we're in a kind of protected waterway. So once they get to our region, delivering to the smaller communities is a little bit easier, but it's still definitely quite a feat to get to all these small communities. So the further north you go in Alaska, the more challenging, the more open water they're on, or a lot of the communities are up river systems or waterways that you can't access in the wintertime. So these are just some of the realities of our state that we definitely face some really challenging environmental limitations to getting access to some of these needed reserves to get us through winter in particular. So now thinking about, now that you got kind of a overall glance of Alaska, so thinking about the value of a tree. So like I said, we're really focused on developing our work around those core values and helping our communities and our students and our decision makers think about energy in a way that's sustainable. And so in the state of Alaska, we definitely are facing some really large energy challenges, not only because the cost of energy, but building infrastructure for energy here is very challenging. A lot of people think about renewable energies in other parts of the world, and just getting the technology to Alaska for a lot of these energies is very, very challenging. And then the other side of that is having people with the technical skills to install and maintain a lot of those technologies is a huge limitation across our state. Here in Southeast Alaska, where we don't have a road system connecting us, we have even more challenges because each community has their own energy system. So we have microsystems basically, and we're not connected at all because the landscape and lots of varying reasons we can't connect our systems. And so we have to think about different ways, in particular when it comes to heating homes, that we can be more purposeful in how we support communities and help them learn about the value of a tree. But also recognizing culturally there are a lot of important uses of trees. And so being really conscious of that and making sure our approach is culturally responsive, environmentally responsive, and can have sustainability. And so I want everyone, before I kind of switch this over, to think, what uses do you have for trees in your community? And so just thinking about where you live, your community, what are uses for trees in your community? And if I can have folks maybe pop that into the chat, and I can share some of the what's being shared. So uses we have for trees in your community. Yep, oxygen, fireplaces, ornament, shad. Yep, shade is a big one, right? For cooling, we talk a lot about that as well. Oh, yep, holly, heating in Fairbanks. Yes, I appreciate that. Shade, recreation, art. Great. Yeah, so this is something that I would typically do with students or community members, to think about the uses of trees in their community. Um, oh, great. Yeah, thank you for sharing those. So, here's kind of the list that we've come up with, like asking students or community members, and some of you have shared some of these. So heating for firewood, we have lots of different uses, just I think collectively as humans, right? So building tree houses, shade, as someone mentioned, reducing erosion, um, totem pole, sap, forest ecology, health, mental health. I have some really amazing. We have an organization here in Southeast called Sea Stories, that they work with students to develop these little short digital stories about the value or importance of different things in their community. And one that a student made was about the mental health of our forests and how important they are for everyone, but in particular our youth in some of these really rural communities. Um, so the things that I'm going to focus on with that, what I'm going to share for the rest of the presentation, is firewood, and then the absorption of carbon dioxide, and then providing oxygen. I do want to say my journey with Globe and using kind of this concept of value of a tree started with a classroom project where we were looking at carbon sequestration of trees, and we were looking at different size trees and different species of trees in our area. And where I taught, we had the forest was right outside of my classroom door. And so we had students looking at different sizes of trees and how they sequestered carbon in our area. And then that turned into some pretty amazing questions from our youth about changes in our environment. We've had some massive flooding in our community that's taken out a lot of trees across next to our river system. And so students had some really great questions about that, and actually got to go and present with Peter Falcon at a large, really cool regional presentation about the research they did and some of the findings that they had. So as a classroom teacher, this all started for me as thinking about carbon sequestration, and then turned into students kind of unpacking the value of trees in our community. And so thinking about each community is going to have different uses and focuses. And but I think the one thing that we can all relate to no matter our region, is the absorption of carbon dioxide and then providing oxygen. And then in my region, also using it for firewood is a really important aspect of what we think about. And then I do want to mention that the value of the cultural responsibility for trees, and that in our area we do really think a lot about the types of trees and the age of the tree and whether it should be harvested or not, or whether it would be a tree that would be used for something like a totem pole or something for a clan house. So those are other considerations that we take into when we are assessing trees in our region. So I do want to also add, so this is a My NASA activity, and this is something that I've added to activities when I go into the classroom and kind of assess value of a tree with students. And I think this is really important because it gets us thinking about from a view from a satellite, like a forest can look really healthy and look like it's doing really well. But in our region, what we've learned, and I'm sure this is across the world, not just in a Southeast Alaska challenge, but we did have a lot of logging here for a long time. And so as that new growth has come back, it's too dense for a lot of our animal populations. And so a lot of our communities rely on subsistence-based hunting and fishing. And so what we have found is in that new growth area that the density of the trees with that new growth is too dense for the deer and moose and different ungulates to kind of move through. And so they've had to go in and start doing some clearing to keep those populations healthy. The other realization is that some challenges with the streams nearby, that where like culverts and things were put in, that's really impacting our salmon runs. And so going in and doing some mitigation in these forests, even though from a satellite image they could look really, really healthy, that from the ground looking in and being in that forest is that they're realizing that these forests really need some support with a little bit of clearing and adjustments. And so we've have a lot of partnerships with the Forest Service and training locals to go in and do some mitigation in these forests, so that the salmon and animal populations can thrive. So that's some of the conversation we have with students and looking at these Landsat images and looking at that carbon sequestration and whether trees versus the area without the trees, which one holds more carbon. And so it's a really simple way to get students recognizing how different parts of an environment can hold carbon and sequester carbon. And then we're able to talk about also the health of our forests. So that sometimes that satellite imagery tells one story, but then when you're on the ground actually in the forest working with the community, you recognize that that story is not always aligned. So this is a great activity to get students thinking about that value of our trees and recognizing the importance of the carbon that they are processing. And then another activity that has been adapted from a globe carbon cycle activity is having students move through a system as a molecule of carbon. And so this is another addition that I've brought in from some of the NASA and globe work into the work that we do with our activities. But this is a really great one that I've adjusted to look at specifically our systems. So we've like turned it into an activity where students start as a molecule in kelp, and then they move through a system in our kind of more localized environment. And it gets students really thinking about how carbon moves through systems. So this is just another edition of an activity. As I mentioned, when I did this with students in the classroom, when we're looking at carbon sequestration, there's a really specific activity of pre and post where students, and this is linked here on this QR code. So if you're interested, you can just check the QR or scan the QR code, but it's a really great, it's, I would say, a little more in depth for getting students to look at kind of two different time frames of carbon sequestration on a global scale. And then we've simplified the activity and made it just what carbon does in a forest and ocean system in Southeast Alaska, for example. So there's the idea that all of these things can be adapted to your community, and your experiences for your students or your community members is really important. That recognizing that all of these are things that you can simplify or elevate to whatever level that you want based on who you're working with. So this is another example of the type of activity that we would do. Let's see, I'm trying to see this comment here. Oh, headers.
Yeah, Adriana, it's just basically about sort of the details, right? About different trees store different amounts, and so depending on where you are in the world, you're going to have to adapt this.
Yeah.
But the larger point is that once an area has enough of that vertical structure, you are with trees, you are sequestering in a different way than a grassland. So that
Yeah.
land cover map, at least gives us a little bit of this conversation that you're presenting here with actually even like a little bit of the difference between this forested pixel or treed pixel, right?
Mhm.
And even thinking about our grassland landscapes that are sequestering carbon, but they're putting it more underground, right? And so even how we see that in that satellite data is kind of different. So
Yeah.
yeah, Luis, yeah, thanks for bringing that up about sort of that adaptation, piece of things. And I'll highlight, this piece of things, Adriana, in a little bit about, that's the purpose of these land cover maps, is to give you a sense for generally where is carbon on the landscape.
Mhm.
And it always goes into those specifics of, okay, now we got to go out and measure and figure out exactly those details.
Yeah.
And so yeah, thanks for that little diversion right there. But I wanted to jump in and help you on that quick chat.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, and I think that's kind of the next piece to this. So these are activities I do kind of leading up to getting students like thinking about like, how is carbon held in systems? How does carbon move in systems? What's the difference between a place with trees versus no trees? And then we kind of get into those exactly kind of the concept of like those nitty gritty. What happens if a tree is really tall? What happens with the species of different trees? Um, and so this is where there is Globe has developed this really like amazing and complex spreadsheet that you can go and you can type in your type of tree, you can or your species of tree, the height. You go and you take students out and you do all these measurements, and you can get really exact calculated data of how much carbon is being sequestered by that specific tree. And so that's the initial project that my students did. So we went and tagged the trees, we did all the measurements, we plugged all the data in. It ended up being a really amazing project. We ended up having over 200 students collecting data on that project alone. And it was great. It was an awesome project that we were able to do school wide. And then kind of the pivot point was then when I stepped away from my school district and stepped out of that kind of formal classroom. My organization had worked with some folks from Globe to kind of take that same concept and figure out, okay, well, how can we use that data to then calculate using BTUs and understanding how much wood would be needed by an individual to heat their home versus using heating oil. And so this was just an opportunity to take all that work that Globe had already done and then work collaboratively with REAP to develop this really specific tool to think about energy content. So this is where that kind of nitty gritty detail of species of tree and then the height and size of the tree come in. So, and this is something specific to our region. We primarily are using hemlock and Sitka spruce are the two most common for Southeast Alaska, depending on where you are, right? You're going to have some different variations and different species that maybe are more likely to be used in your community. But this gives community members and students a really great way to think about that energy content that's being held, right, stored in these different species and the different sizes. And so the activity we go out, we collect data, we measure different spruce or different hemlock or whatever tree species you have in your area. And then students are able to do some comparative analysis and say, well, if I have, a choice between spruce or hemlock, which tree makes the most sense to harvest and for the use of heating my home. And so this also does have some options to include like things like wood pellets, which is not common in our area, but is more common up in other parts of Alaska because they have the infrastructure to create their own wood pellets. What you learn is that different trees have varying energy contents, that using dry wood with 20% moisture or less is really the key. And we talk a lot about that with our communities, is that it's really important to season your wood and make sure you have a process for drying it out, and that what that can look like and splitting and stacking and storing the wood. And so we work closely with communities to develop processes to help dry out that wood before it's delivered to community members. And so this is part of the work that we do is working closely with communities to help them understand not only recognizing the value of trying to keep as many trees in our community as we can, but also that when we need to harvest trees, which are the best ones to harvest, or if we already have down trees, how do we make sure we're seasoning that wood to make sure that we're getting the most energy content out of that wood? And so these are just some of the conversations that we are able to have within our communities and are helping teach our youth. So for example, we have in our region some really large systems that are, for example, heating schools. And the youth are the ones that are doing a lot of the prepping of the wood, and they are getting paid to do that as a way to fundraise for their sports, for example. And so the youth are learning this skill set as they go, and then they're able to share that at home. They're able to share it with the younger students that are coming up. They're going to fulfill those roles as well. And so thinking about what we do when we go through this process, like I mentioned, so we're going to identify the mature native tree. We're going to take our measurements and record the circumference in tree in centimeters. And we're using that kind of breast height, 1.4 meters from the ground. We gather all that data, we add it to a spreadsheet collectively. And then as a group, we have a discussion around what we're seeing the data, because it's a nice spreadsheet that you just plug everything in and it kind of exports the final data for you. And so being able to have that comparative analysis discussion with students is really powerful, and recognizing how many trees do you need is really the idea with the spreadsheet. And so acknowledging that the trees, depending on the species, have different BTUs, and then based on your region, it allows you to calculate like how many of those trees would you need to heat your home for the whole year versus what is the cost of heating your home with heating oil. And so recognizing those two differences, and then talking a little bit about that outcome of environmental impacts as well. And then some assumptions and things that we've simplified through this activity is we're assuming the home has average insulation. We're also making some assumptions about BTU demand for a cold day. We know that fluctuates regionally. You do get to put in what region you live in the state, or for our little spreadsheet, and that takes some of those considerations in. So we've done some adjustments depending on what part of the state the data is being put in from. And then we're also assuming that you're heating your home at 65 degrees Fahrenheit for the temperature. But as I mentioned, it's a really helpful acknowledgement for community members and students to see, like, which species of tree and the size of the tree, saying like, hey, if you had a spruce versus a hemlock that were the same size, you can see the difference of how many more or less trees you would need, which really does, I think, help students recognize the difference in the concept of BTUs, which is really confusing and kind of hard to grasp. So it does kind of give them a representation of it that's like, oh, I see this tree, this one burns hotter. Okay, that helps me understand that it's going to put off more heat. So that's been a really kind of aha moment as I've been in the classroom working with students with this particular version of the value of a tree. And then, like I mentioned, this leads to our discussion is how are the health of our ecosystems and value of a tree connected? Why is it important to be energy efficient with our fuel sources? And then what messages do you want to share with your community about what you've learned? So this is an example of the type of activities that I can go and do with students or with community members in like workshops, and getting them to think about this bigger picture, future generation, stewardship, like all these kind of core values that are tied to our region and to the people of this place. And with that, that's kind of the overarching how I choose to interact with kind of this value of a tree, and some of the work that my organization has done to kind of really make sure that we're engaging with communities in a way that they can grasp and understand. So that is all I have for everybody, and I'm happy to take questions or comments, and I appreciate everybody's time.
Thanks, Adriana. You already answered a question, and you're getting some nice little emojis there. So thank you for answering that earlier question. And if anyone else has any questions, please put them in the chat. I'd be happy to read them out. My question for you is, we have so many different partners in so many different regions that also have, maybe resources limitations. How, if other partners would like to do something like what you're doing, how would they establish something like that in their communities? Who should they reach out to? Sort of like a little things you put together, like a little guideline, like do A, B, and C type deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, 17 years in education and now getting to work in the nonprofit world of education is, I would say, I think it's so important to recognize, like, we don't have to recreate the wheel. Like, all this amazing work has been done by, and it's time, like digging in and finding the different organizations or the partners that have already done this type of work. But I would say in terms of tracking, like what to do next, yeah, it's really tricky, especially I think for educators, it's in particularly tricky. I was really lucky when I joined, kind of got involved with Globe. I think just Alaska is very special, and we're a huge state, but really close knit. And so the support I was provided to really like dig in and do this kind of work. And I had a great team of teachers that were willing to like take this journey with me. So I didn't have to do it alone. And so, yeah, I think that's a great question, Peter. And I don't have a very straightforward answer for it, but I would say just recognizing that we don't have to recreate the wheel, and, putting those questions out there. Like, I'm happy anyone that's interested in doing this, like, reach out, send an email. I'm more than happy to give you the resources, give you the presentations, and then you adapt it. But recognizing like I think when I initially went to the Globe training, it didn't totally align with some of the challenges we were facing in our community. But then recognizing like I could take the pieces that made sense for me and my community and my group of students, and then I adapted all of it. And the Globe team was great at supporting me and figuring out how to adapt it for my community and my region. So I don't know if that answers your question, Peter, but that's kind of my
Yeah,
experience with it.
yeah. Another piece that I really enjoy is the culture piece. I know Alaska is very huge on this. I've heard a lot of Alaskan presentations, and they always bring in the culture, working with ancestors, working with the older generation.
Yeah.
Um, and I see a lot of that in other globe regions as well. Can you go into that aspect a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's and and I will say this, I'm not Alaska Native, and so this was a stretch for me to go to take these concepts and say, like, how can I work with my local entities to make sure that I'm bringing culture in a respectful manner, and how do I even do that without overstepping a boundary that I don't even know necessarily where that boundary exists. Um, and so I just started asking lots of questions of the folks that work within our tribal entities. And I was just fully supported. Everyone was like, yes, here's some stories. Here's some language that you can incorporate in. Oh, we have like cultural specialists that we can invite into the classroom. And that's where it just started, is saying, like, hey, I don't know how to do this. Is someone willing to kind of guide me through it? And then I built a lot of confidence through that. And so now I have lots of stories that I can share, tied to the value of a tree. Um, I've built my knowledge on the core values and generational expectations of the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian people. So, and that just took time, but I am really lucky. My region is very focused on engaging in being culturally responsive in the work that we do, and they have lots of teacher trainings and they have lots of partnerships. But I would say, um, yeah, just reaching out to your local, if you have a tribal affiliate, and just saying, hey, here's something I'm really hoping to do. Do you have any suggestions? That just goes a long way in starting to build that relationship and trust with your tribes and your community. And I got it wrong a lot in the beginning, and I apologized a lot in the beginning. And now I have to do it less because I have more knowledge to lean on, and I have more partners that I can call upon and say, like, hey, I have this activity, can you come in and help present or share the story, the traditional story connected to this? And it's been really great. And it
Thank you.
gives
Yeah.
and I will say, sorry, one additional piece to that is to see students that maybe felt like they didn't have a place, or that they couldn't tell their story, or that they didn't fit in because of being Indigenous or being from other cultures. And this isn't just focused on Alaska Native, just being culturally responsive in my classroom and in the work that I do. And then seeing them be able to, like, stand up and be like, share a story or share an experience of the value of being in the forest for them or for their people or their family. Creating that space for students is so important. So a lot of that, I got to lean more on my students, and they became the ones that could bring that knowledge into the classroom, as I learned to build a more safe space for students to do that.
That is awesome. I love the way you worded that. And I love the fact that you said, I got some stuff wrong. And, I corrected. I apologize. I'm very sensitive. But that's the way you learn. And I think that was great. And I think it's something that the other partners in other regions can work off of and really use as an example.
Yeah.
There's one more question that we have from Lewis. Let me see if I can read that very quickly. He says, I normally watch some programs about Alaska, and I realize that now people are using to let me paraphrase it probably. Now people are using too much energy sources, like solar panels or small windmills, that complementary kind of tools is increasing in that area.
Mhm.
um, it seems, or amongst the population prefers traditional ways in using wood. If you can
Yeah.
paraphrase that.
Yeah, absolutely. There is additional energies coming into our state, in particular renewable energies. Um, but again, a lot of the challenge, and there's a great video from Thorn Bay that I really appreciated, where they talked about bringing So they have a huge system in Thorn Bay that they're using cordwood to heat their whole school, and it also heats a greenhouse. And like I mentioned, the students are the ones doing the work. They've trained them and how to keep the big, I can't think of the right term, but the big like generator going and all these things. And they're saying like, we're keeping all our money local, we're keeping a workforce, we're doing all these things. And so a little bit of the challenge, like I mentioned earlier, with different renewable energies or any energy coming in, is Alaska is really tricky because it's so hard to access so many of our communities. That even like solar panels, like installing solar panels is really tricky in our state because we don't really have installers. So we have to bring them from other states to do it. And then when they need maintenance, it's not enough to have someone full-time maintaining them. So then what does that person do the rest of the year when they're not maintaining, like work-wise, in these really rural communities? And it's so expensive to travel in our state. So there's a lot of limitations just by how rural a lot of our communities are with no road systems. And so that's where like heating with wood is really helpful, but there's definitely parts of the state that it's not doable because they don't have large trees. Like someone mentioned that in my region, we don't have large trees, and that's in our state too. We have places that have really small trees that actually don't make a lot of sense for heating. And so what are those other energy sources? And so wind is one in our state that's one that's coming in on board in a lot of smaller communities. And solar at times is, but yeah, so geothermal is one that's kind of being explored more. Hydro, all the easy hydro projects have already been done. So now they're all really expensive projects that might not make sense fiscally for communities. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea. And then we have so much fishing. Commercial fishing is such a large part of our state that offshore wind technology here for us is not really one that's super viable yet. But again, a lot of us, our systems are so microgridded that it's really hard to think about some of these other large technologies because our systems aren't connected in our state. In Southeast Alaska, we don't have any of our systems connected to other communities. Like each community has their own microgrid system. So yeah, so energy in our communities is really tricky. It's really complex. And so the heating is one that I think is, for Southeast Alaska anyways, is something that we can tackle a little bit more easily with the biomass systems.
It's funny you mentioned offshore because Luis also mentions that in Portugal, they just installed three large windmills in the ocean as well. So I guess every region has their own issues, their own way of handling things, and what they have to work around as well.
Yep.
I did. I'm looking through. I don't see any more questions, but I did have one more comment I wanted to make before we go on to the next presenter. Is I love the fact that as you mentioned, you didn't reinvent the wheel. You leaned on a lot of people that are experts in their fields. You leaned on Globe with a lot of the activities that they had, and just basically use that and kind of tweaked a little bit to work in your region. I love, as you were talking, I was busy scanning your QR codes, and so I was looking through those. Those are really cool activities, and just want to say once again, awesome job. And I love those activities. So I'm probably going to use some of them when I go out and do webinars and do other stuff as well with my local community here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Peter. I really appreciate that. And yeah, and it just comes with being willing to, I don't know. I'm like, I'm not an expert in anything. I'm like, actually, I would say I'm an expert at like resourcing. Like there's so many people that have the knowledge and the, thought process that maybe I'm not going to get to. And so just asking for help and asking questions is the key. And yeah, I'm definitely a better advocate for my community because I was willing to say like, this isn't my expertise. So how can I effectively do this in my community?
Awesome. And I think we're going to close with a perfect comment from Anathesis. We love Alaska. Cold or hot?
Well,
Very
thank you, everybody.
interesting. All right, Brian, back to you. And once again, thank you, Adriana.
Yep. Thank you, Adriana. Yeah, what a great presentation and a great perspective to one that we don't often hear with the campaign. So thank you so much for that. It's great to go back to that. We have the scientific aspect, but to that culture aspect as well. So something that we definitely need. So thank you so much for that and agreeing to do the presentation today. So thank you so much. All right. So here we go. So we are going to finish off with Peter Nelson, and I don't have to introduce Peter Nelson very much, but I'm going to. So we have Professor Peter Nelson and Senior Instructor 1, Senior Faculty Research Assistant 2 at the College of Earth, Ocean, Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University, Corvallis, Oregon, in the United States. And bring it on home for us, Peter. And I will stop sharing and pass it over to you.
Thanks, Brian. I really appreciate that. And Adriana, thank you so much for, kind of highlighting these different dimensions of the value that people bring to trees. And I think one of the things that really strikes me is that, the value might be of this generation and it might change in the future. As you were highlighting, areas that are really dense, that are hard to see through, a nice metric that we get with our ground photos. It actually, creates a different relationship with that environment. That ability to move through there is one of these things that sometimes is why my grandparents loved a certain place, but I go back there today and it has been overgrown with different vegetation. So I think this is a really interesting piece as you think about a place and this moment of time that you're experiencing. And Adriana, I think, that idea of how long does it take for a tree to grow to become something of heating warmth to us? I think, sort of to me is always the place that I've always talked to other people about, how do you stay warm? And so I think, to me, that's one of those nice places where a lot of us are thinking longer term about how long will this tree take for me to be able to do this thing with it. And so Adriana, I really, appreciate this time dimension that you've, really brought to, many different people, because I think it allows us to make decisions, right? Do I do it this year? Do I wait another year? Do I wait another year? And what might end up happening in the environment, in between now and, that potential would, for electricity or heating or whatever that need is in the future. And so, it's an art, I think, to making some of these decisions. And this is where the digital data helps us to make some of those decisions. Knowing where things are in the landscape, again, helps us to get a sense for, are we at a place where we can actually use this for this purpose? So I think, that to me is this value of a tree, kind of piece of things. And I want to highlight, some of these metrics, that we're actually seeing in our data. And this to me is one of these things of when you work together, your individual data might get sort of lost. But just like an individual tree doesn't make a forest. You need to work together, and at a certain stage, you start seeing some interesting patterns. And sometimes those patterns are for a variety of reasons, but that becomes the science. And I want to highlight that because, one of the things that we do see is if we just look at this one value that people have been doing with Globe Observer over this amount of time since we first launched the land cover tool, is recording leaves on the trees, and whether they're always there or whether they're sometimes there or whether they're really never there. And so what you notice, and so this is something that you can actually use in your own community to look at that type of species that is there. A birch tree will actually lose its leaves at a certain moment in time, while a hemlock or one of these other species that you might end up using for a certain purpose might always keep its leaves. Even in February, it technically might have its needle leaf still on there, right? And so, just by recording this little value of when leaves are on trees is something that can, again, give you insights into your environment, and again, might lead you into a certain list of things and their carbon numbers or their biomass numbers or all kinds of different things, including how long have they been there? Right. That's again one of these things that thinking about growth rates allows you to think about that future, and how long 8 generations are, Adriana. Is there a standard number that you guys use with each generation? Is it 40 years, 50 years? How long, when you say a generation, like, is there a length of time that you're thinking about with that number?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've actually never asked that. I will have to ask. That's a great question.
Yeah, and I think, again, like just kind of when we think about generations or use that word generation, right? A generation of a tree, certain trees only have a certain, or will have a certain lifespan to them. And to me, this is kind of that wonderful piece of your hypothesis. And Adriana, you really kind of hit on how you build this hypothesis with some of these activities, and then you actually go out and you check it out, right? And I think one of the things that, again, kind of going back to this question of when do we have green up in our community, when do we have green down, is one of these things that we're seeing partly because of the contributions of the global community here, right? And so I just want to encourage everybody to keep doing that globe observer piece of things, whether it is tree height or whether it's the land cover, because you're actually helping us to record this green down that we've actually seen and recorded. Some years it's different than others. October, November here, wow, we really saw a big change globally in 2023. And again, you might see this in your community due to elevation, or to maybe who is participating. So there's a lot of questions that you can use. But if we do this well enough, this aligns with the satellite data that is getting recorded. That's just much more consistent. And that, again, can help us maybe make some of those decisions that Adriana brought up. Again, going back to how much biomass is there, right, in our community. So I just want to encourage everybody that here's a dashboard or a way that I have been tracking just this really interesting attribute of whether there's leaves on the trees or whether there's not. And so keep that up. Oh, and we'll revisit this coming up, because one of the things that we do see out there that I want to highlight that some of our metrics for this carbon question really are regionally based, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. So I want to focus here on this really interesting metric that has been calculated for the European region. And one of the things that I want to really highlight is a lot of times many of us only think of green up happening once a year. But you might actually have vegetation where the biomass is actually going up and down, and you might have 3 opportunities to actually get biomass that you can turn into power. And so again, one of the things that we want to be thinking about is, is this something that we can grow really quick and turn into biomass, or is it something that we actually want to be thinking about that is taking a year time span, and we really have to be thinking again on that generational time span. And so I really love this, because one of the things that I notice is that Southern Europe actually has a couple of these 2 times where they actually have green ups going on within a year. That to me is not the world that I live in. And as we go north, you actually start to see how, in some cases, you actually have zero green up in some cases, right? And those are places where there's no vegetation, right? But to me, this is one of these really fascinating things is as we move northward, you start to see some interesting phenology patterns that again go back to this choice and these decisions that might lead you to certain crops. And remember, our trees a lot of times are crops. Okay, and so first getting going and exploring maps like this, and as you zoom in again, you start to get some really interesting details that lead into building up that hypothesis. And again, might be indicators of climate change or different opportunities that maybe a different generation took advantage of. And what I mean by that is you can actually see things like clear cutting of trees, and now you are actually getting a double green up or a triple green up in some of these areas. So this very simple notion of tracking green on the landscape and how often it occurs within a moment of time, is one of these things that again is going to be different up in the northern far north versus areas that are closer to the equator. But again, this notion of what we're recording and how important that is to things like biomass or our decision making, I want to highlight to everybody some of these tools that might be out there that, again, might be the research that you have to do because we don't have it easily available for our location that we're studying or living in, right? But this way of thinking about green up, not just happening once a year, but actually happening multiple times throughout a year, is transformational to me. And many of us might be starting to experience more green up than what we have in the past. And that's something I want you to pay attention to when you go out is in those down photos. Is that grass green? Because that is one of these things that sometimes is why we see these multiple numbers or green ups is you might have early season green up that's grass, and then you actually have the canopy green up of the birch, as Adriana was highlighting, right? And so again, these are just some really interesting metrics that are available in some places. The other thing I wanted to highlight for our European friends, since we can really focus on the United States, but there's a lot of really interesting activity and data that you can use to then go and explore some of these other questions. And what I mean by that is there are these forest type attributes and locations that give you a way of starting to think about that carbon. Again, is it a broadleaf forest or is it a conifer forest? And as Adriana, you highlighted, you can go look these numbers up and at least get a sense for, is there more in this landscape or less in this landscape? And it starts the conversation about where you want to go, what you want to do next. And so I just want to, say hats off to our European Union colleagues over here who have a whole different data set to kind of go through and explore. And I love going through and starting to just look at what's available. Because again, as we were highlighting, what is possible in one place may not be possible in another. And the first place you might be actually going into is just creating those data tables or adapting what somebody else has done to your location. So, just kind of pay attention to some of these things that are out there that can inform what you are seeing and maybe some of these opportunities, for your community to really learn about your area. Okay, so I'm going to end here with going back to kind of how a scientist might think about the value of a tree. And that's by putting numbers to everything on Earth, right? And so we've highlighted this this tool before because it really allows you to get some metrics about individual tree species and their carbon. And so you can actually then get some dollar amounts related to the value of that tree. And again, these economic pieces feed into what different areas might decide. And again, recognizing that the value of a tree today might not be the same as what it is in the future. And so I want to go back that this is the way that scientists try to look at the landscape, try to quantify it in a way that might help people like Adriana then make decisions. Because at some point, you kind of have to take all this uncertainty and make a choice. Because it really is sometimes about being warm tonight or keeping that in the landscape or leaving it there for the future. And I want to highlight how when I look at the globe database, a lot of what I end up seeing is choices from the past, right? The fact that I can actually go out and see trees that look like this might be because somebody made choices ahead of me to protect those trees from fire or from disturbance, or again, not using them for their own uses today, but thinking about my needs. That here I am, 50 years later, having this conversation with you all and being able to talk about who's living in this habitat in this area and who also might value these trees beyond the humans that are in this conversation, right? And so I want to bring that science perspective to there's many different ways of valuing these pixels and these landscapes, but recognize that those decisions end up being part of the conversation in the future. And so just be aware of these decisions and let's try to be open and transparent so that we can understand why the world looks the way that it does. And when we start exploring landscapes like this, we can understand these trade-offs that have to be made between the now and the future. So, Adriana, thanks for bringing us that perspective of the value of a tree from your part of the world, and Brian, I hope that this helps people to understand why we've done some of what we've done, and how this science data coming from NASA and our remote sensing perspective can maybe sometimes fill in gaps when we weren't thinking about that value or even maybe that landscape and what is out there.
Thank you, Peter, for bringing bringing that home and showing those online tools and bringing those back to back to people's brains. Things that we've talked about before. As part of the campaign. Does anybody have any questions for Peter or ones that you may have thought of for Adriana from her presentation? And Peter and Adriana, you can check in the chat if there's anything you want to look at. Louise,
yeah, I think one of the things that I want to stress is that you can actually see these cultural values come through the landscape, and even and seeing 40-year-old trees tells you something about that there was something about that moment in time that was important. Why it is becomes, again, I think sometimes a cultural piece that is not in the scientific data or in those measurements of sunlight. And we see this especially a lot in the European Union, where you have a lot of governmental change or policy change. And you can really go back and look at why people made those choices. And the science data of the satellite data like this actually allows somebody like me to come in and and ask the question of, well, did it turn out the way that they planned? And that's sort of this legacy that I feel like we're leaving behind, especially in these places where it does take even 10 years for that tree to spectrally show up in our satellite data. And so really recognizing that not all trees are created equal or growing at the same rate, even if they're the same species. Depending on where you are in the world, it becomes this really interesting and fascinating question that really does bring in how people are using those landscapes. And this is something that keeps surprising a lot of the NASA people who are looking at the pixels, and they're trying to determine numerically, oh, is that what's happening in that area? And you actually talk to the people like what Adriana's doing, and you find out that, oh, they have taken out 20 trees this last winter to heat their home with. And they've been doing that continually for the last 15 years. And that's what we're actually seeing happening in that pixel is people changing those landscapes. And then you go to another place and you have beetles doing the same number change, but the reason for that change is different. And so, a lot of, I just really appreciate, how important it is to bring together this local knowledge together with all of the satellite numbers or these ground photos that we are sort of capturing. So I want to encourage everybody, go back through some of the tools we presented and think about, again, what were some of these predictions that have been made about the world that you're living in now? And trees are long lived, so they give us this nice advantage. But there's a lot of these things that Adriana has brought up that it's not just about those trees with biomass. It really is about all vegetation. So so just kind of expand your knowledge a little bit about the different ways that the carbon cycle is happening in your location. And I could, as you can tell, reach out. We can talk more about the carbon cycle and sunlight and all the data that you can get out of that. Um, but that's where your values and what do you want to be looking at really come into a lot of the discussion, because my perception on these pixels might be different than others. And so there's many different values of our pixels. So I hope you've learned a little bit about today and what we've been sort of wanting to do with a pivot to thinking about the many different dimensions of a pixel. It's not just, yes, there's trees there. No, there's not trees there. Gets into a lot of the different pieces that Adriana highlighted today in terms of who's there, what do we want to do with them, and what are these trade-offs that we're making with the carbon cycle. So thanks for hosting us, Brian.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Yep. And you may have seen in the chat, Adriana shared her presentation link. So thank you for that. Anyone else have any questions? All right, then. Thank you to Adriana and Peter. And we will adjourn and hope to see you all back here on the 11th of December.